Probably the most famous leadership model ever is the situational leadership model that was developed by Ken Blanchard. You may have heard of Ken Blanchard. He's written numerous books over time. Um, his first and most famous was The 1 Minute Manager, which was written long ago. He's done many follow-ups to that in so many different aspects to situational leadership. In fact, Ken, when he actually toyed with the title situational leadership and actually wanted to build off the work of the great Robert Greenleaf and his outstanding book on servant leadership. And Ken thought it would be a good idea to call it servant leadership, but from a marketing perspective, he wasn't really clear that corporate world type executives would invest in something called servant leadership. Regardless, situational leadership works just as well, and it is really implemented in so many companies. In fact, when he worked with us over at Amex, he basically said if you don't see significant gains in your key indicator by implementing all of the principles of situational leadership, I will refund your money 100%. That's how confident he was in his work, and frankly, nobody's. I mean, he's not dope. I mean, he knows that nobody's going to put everything in place that he recommends. But it's very well researched, and the patterns of behavior that he describes really seem to play out. It starts off with the idea: what are the key skills that a leader must have, and especially a situational leader. First and foremost, the ability to diagnose people, diagnose situations. To sort of be an excellent assessor, if you will. The second skill is the ability to be flexible and understand that what you do in one situation is not what you do in another situation. The situation drives your leadership. And third, how do you partner with people to create performance? That was his. Those are his three key skills required to be an excellent leader. And diagnosis actually can occur in these two lists right here. The first part he talked about was what he called it skill at some points in his books. He called it knowledge at some points in his books. He called it competence at some points in his books. These are things like how much training and education does the person have? How much does the person perceive their role correctly or the task? Do they understand the task, or do they have the right experience? And again, throughout his books, he called these different terms, but basically this is roughly what he's talking about. And in the second grouping, at some point he called it will, or he called it motivation, or he called it commitment. And these are the things which are the desire to achieve, or the incentives that were in place, or the security that people were feeling, or the confidence that people had to do the task. The shortcut on this is evaluating skill and will. I like those two terms because they rhyme and they're easy to remember. I think the most contemporary ones as competence and commitment. I think that's what he's using more so now. But in any case, this idea to understand these two groups of ideas here. As we go into the actual model, and you'll see there are differences that he has in the different books here as well. So we start with beginners. So somebody who is a beginner, somebody who's newly hired or newly promoted into a role, would by design, because they're new, they don't necessarily have the skill to do the specific task of that particular job because they haven't necessarily done them before. And even if they've done similar tasks in other organizations, they may not have done them in this organization, right? They may not have the will or the confidence early on because they're kind of new. But because you chose them, because you've asked them to become a part of your organization, because you just promoted them, they're going to give you a high level of commitment. So, in terms of a score, his early books talked about R1, which R stands for readiness, readiness level one. In his later books, he called that D for development, so development level one. They sort of directionally, he's saying the same thing. So, for somebody who's in this situation, who has high commitment, but not necessarily enough skill to do the task at hand and not enough confidence, the appropriate leadership style would be situational leadership style 1, S1, meaning the directing style. In these particular cases, if in that orientation mode, you would see somebody who's leading taking a high task orientation, meaning that they're taking the time to show people what to do. They're telling them what to do. They're explaining things. They're being very attached to the task. And early on, while I wouldn't say that there's no relationship, but the focus is on the task, not on building the relationship. You already have some level of commitment. So it's really on the doing part and less on the relationship part. I could tell you this as as a leader of a team, and I can tell you this as from a corporate team and as a basketball coach. My first practices, when I would take my teams, it wouldn't be sitting around in a circle and saying, "What's your favorite color?" It was things like I would blow the whistle, point to the line, and I would start working on drills. And what I was doing was basically educating my team about how we're going to run every practice without any variation forever. When I took over my team at American Express and I was orienting them to the new strategies, they had a billion ideas, and I was less likely to sort of engage in those conversations while I was, sort of explaining where we were going over time. And again, as you saw in previous sections, I did this through, I tried to be creative in terms of my, storytelling and involving people in my meetings and making them take things on. But my relationships started low to medium, and focus on the task at hand was my initial focus, which Blanchard would suggest is the appropriate way to start. Now, once you start, your S1, the follower starts to change. And what's very interesting is while they may not catch on from a skill perspective right away, but one thing that does happen is their will does pick up. So if I was just hired, for example, from one place and hired into this place, I start to say, "Oh, I get it. I used to do it this way over at my last company." Or, "Oh, I remember what somebody told me this is the way you're supposed to do it." So they start to kind of build sort of a sense of self. The problem is that sense of self may not be connected to the overall picture that you're trying to instill. So in that regard, you start to see this sense of self, the commitment drops because now they're getting more committed to themselves and less to the organization. It's just a natural process. This happens, right? So from that standpoint, you switch from directing to coaching. That's situational leadership style number 2, S2. You're staying on the task. You're continuing to show, right? And you're also being, now your relationship is becoming more supportive in your relationship. You're spending more time coaching, selling, engaging. You're doing a lot more of that. Because you're at a situation where their will can go out of whack because they may not have the skill to perform. Very interesting. Most turnover in organizations happen right here. Where the skill gets ahead of the will gets ahead of the skill, and performance starts to flatline or suffer, and personalities start to play out. And this is really the skill of situational leadership is right when you get to these early stages, when you get to this S2 leadership. Now, moving forward from there, let's say you're able to sort of break down that will to some level, to kind of break down that self, break down that personality, break down those ideas, which gives the individual the opportunity to absorb and maybe build new skills, right, from that perspective. So that's a good thing. That's a good thing. When you're actually bringing somebody's will down so they can actually build more skill, that actually is the way growth works. You need to sort of take a breath and move forward, if you will. So when that happens and people cross over into that R3 level, what happens is they start to have skills, they start to build their personal capabilities, but because they just had a drop in will, they now become cautious, and that's a bad thing. And their commitment is sort of variable. They just kind of went through a difficult time, a difficult transition. This is just very common. If you think about any major change, when you live your life one way for a long period of time and you get thrown into living your life another way, just started it, why would you feel strongly about that, right? You're just too new at it, right? So this does make sense. And the leader needs to recognize that this just happened, that the skill is now there, they're doing the job right, but they're a little burnt out, or I shouldn't say, not really burnt out. They're more, they're kind of like, maybe we'll call it beat down, just as a difference in the way to say that. So now, as a leader, as an S3 leader, you no longer need to spend a lot of time on task direction because they sort of got it. But you need to kind of keep the supportive relationship high to pull them out, and rebuild their confidence, right? So that's the S3 leader. And once you're able to do that, and they already have the skill, now you can say, great, I can now delegate this to you because you have the skill, you have the will, your commitment's back up, you're self-reliant, I can delegate to you. I don't have to spend as much time on the task, I don't have to spend as much time on the relationship. Now, the couple of things that are very important about situational leadership. Let's, by the way, before I go into that, he wrote a great book on the 1 Minute Manager builds high performance teams. And he actually used this exact same model. And he gave the R levels, he gave them names. So you may have even heard these names in terms of team development. So R1 was forming, R2 storming. What a great word, storming. Noisy. You go into a room where you're trying to build the collective wisdom and you're trying to bring the will of a whole team down so that they can listen and build skill as a collective group. You go in, if you hear a lot of noise, they're probably in R2 mode. Because as they're battling and fighting through concepts and trying to get one person's idea of the other person's idea. So storming. So it goes from forming to storming. Once they stop storming and are able to understand truly as a group what the direction is and the strategy is, then they go into norming. So forming, storming, norming, and then last one is performing. So Blanchard was pretty smart in the way he captured that. And I would imagine you've heard those phrases before, but they're very illustrative of what's actually going on there. Now, the other thing which is very, very important is that this applies at the task level. So just because you're an R4 on one task doesn't mean you're an R4 on all tasks. In fact, you may be an R2 on some, and an R1 on some, and an R3 on some. One of the things that Blanchard did is when you would write your goals, and we actually implemented this a bit. It was very clever. Is when you write your annual goals for any particular year. His suggestion was to actually write from your own perspective what you think your R score is. I think I'm an R1 on this. I think I'm an R4 on this. I think I'm an R2 on this. And then when you're presenting your final goals to your supervisor, if you will, and you start talking about it, this is what he meant by partnering for performance. That together you would sort of decide what kind of support that you would need from your leader, what S score was appropriate from that standpoint. So really brilliant to have that back and forth. Very often, people who are R2 think that they're R4 because their will is very high. They think they know what they're doing, but they really don't. So that's a catch. That's sort of a trap, if you will. So you got to pay attention to that in a big way. So the other thing is sometimes these roles can work backwards. So for example, you may have some R4s who have, say, your person who's been in a job for a long, long, long time, does the same thing for a long time, hasn't moved throughout the organization. That person may slide backwards into R3 and lose some commitment, and lose some confidence. They can still do the job, but they kind of slide back. And really, that's really up to the leader to manage properly. So if you're not continually giving your people new goals and new challenges, you run the risk of having them slide backwards from R4 to R3. The other one, which is very, very dangerous situation, is when they move from R1 to R2 and maybe from R2 to R3. If a leader continues to stay in that S1 mode, of directing and telling and micromanaging, even though it's no longer required, you actually run the risk of people running backwards, from R3 to R2 to R1. And you can actually create an organization where people only do what you tell them to do. And that's a terrible place to be. And that creates a very, very vicious cycle. They probably are better than they're behaving, but you have sort of influenced their ability to just sit on their hands and wait to be told what to do. So that's a misappropriation of the S1 style, that you hold on to it for too long. So hopefully that was a good overview and starting point for you on situational leadership. Again, I'm a huge proponent of this. I've seen it work beautifully throughout organizations, and I highly recommend you get yourself knowledgeable on Ken Blanchard's work. So again, I look forward to having more conversations on this, and thank you for your time and listening. Take care.